Nice. Hello, and let's take a look at theory of knowledge and formulating knowledge questions, or KQs for short. So, knowledge questions are all about how humans figure stuff out. How do we decide what is real, what's not real? How do we know when it's time to update our knowledge and information? Now, there's basically two types of questions that we talk about in ToK, or theory of knowledge. So we've got our first order questions and second order questions. First order questions are those that are subject specific. So they're dealing with, say, for example, history or economics, or physics, maths, English, your subject level questions. Second order questions are the ones that we're interested in for theory of knowledge, and they are all about knowledge. How do we figure stuff out? How do we determine what is knowledge in those different subject areas, and what ways of knowing do we use to create that knowledge? So here's an example. So subject specific is first order questions, and knowledge questions are second order questions. So here's a first order question, subject specific. How does gravity affect time? Now that's firmly in the physics subject area, and physics is in the natural sciences area of knowledge. We can make that a better question. Is physics the most accurate science? So now we've got a debatable question, which is more suitable for an essay in ToK or presentation. But is it a knowledge question? No, it's not. So it's debatable, but it's not a knowledge question yet. It's not a second order question yet. Here is a knowledge question at second order. How certain is knowledge in different areas of knowledge, or AOKs for short? So now we've got a second order question, and you can see that it's about knowledge and how certain or how confident can we be in the knowledge that the different areas of knowing generate. And that gives us the flexibility to look at different AOKs as well. So it's important when you are framing your knowledge questions and your knowledge claims as well, and your essay and your presentation, to make sure you're using ToK terminology. And that's the language we use in class. So that basically comes down to the ways of knowing and the areas of knowledge. It focuses on the language of analysis and evaluation. So you're trying to figure out how something works, or how we can justify it, or how important it is. So here are some examples of this type of language: knowledge, justification, interpretation, judgment, evidence, theory, explanation, coherence, assumptions, implications, reason, emotion, sense perception, language, and paradigm are all examples. That's not all of them, of course, but that's the type of language we're trying to use in theory of knowledge. And so when your teacher or textbook or the ToK guide refers to ToK terminology, this is the type of stuff they mean. So here's some examples of knowledge questions. How important is it to be consistent in our moral reasoning? So we're looking there, the ethics comes to mind here, and we've also got a nice question starter here, how important. So this gives us room to have some inquiry and make a judgment there. To what extent does empathy build moral codes? So that's interesting. We're in the ethics realm, and we're also thinking about, making a judgment on to what extent questions are really useful. And what role do our senses play in the construction of reality? So this is an interesting one. So we're talking about sense perception here. So we're at the second order level. And how reliable is intuition as a way of knowing in different areas of knowledge? And so again, we've got intuition is an important way of knowing, and we're connecting it to the areas of knowledge. So again, we're firmly in the second order question realm, and we're using ToK terminology here. So there's some examples of questions that you could ask in a theory of knowledge assignment or assessment task. So the key point is make sure the question is about how we know things about the world and ourselves. So let's take a look at some examples of questions, and we'll take them through to second order questions. So how is bias determined in history? That's a first order question. It focuses on an area of knowledge and a subject area. So it doesn't move to how we know things in history. Here's a more interesting question, but still not a second order question. Does history change over time? So this is first order. It's a debatable question, which is good, but it still focuses on that single subject area. So now we're going to move into the second order realm. How does knowledge change over time? So now it's a second order question. It sits above that history level, and we're talking about knowledge. We could use history as a subject area, as an area of knowing to help us answer that question, but we could also use natural sciences. We could also use human sciences. And question 4, to what extent does knowledge change over time? And so this is a slightly better question. It's very similar, of course, but now we've added this to what extent frame to it. So now we've got a more open question, and the question itself forces us to draw a conclusion. It forces us to make some judgments that are based on evidence and evaluation, which you do based on your real life situations. So it makes for a much more interesting discussion and conclusion for a ToK assessment task. So how do you build strong second order questions? We're starting here with a lot of how important, to what extent, what role, how reliable. So these types of questions are not simple yes and no questions. They require us to really dig into real life situations, look at the evidence, and make judgments and evaluations and come to some conclusions, because we have to answer that question. We have to say, well, to a small extent or to a large degree, we have to make those choices in our ToK assessment tasks, and that makes for a much stronger question, and a strong question leads us to a really strong answer. So here's some examples of building up a strong knowledge question. We've got our subject specific first order question, and I've got a link here. There's an article in the news about Indigenous justice and its conflict with Australian laws in terms of crime and punishment. Essentially, what's the crime, what's the punishment? And so when do you use Indigenous laws and justice, and when do the police and legal system need to step in? So it's a really interesting article, and it's been a source of conflict and discussion in Australia for quite a long time, given its colonial history. So what laws were broken in the incident in the Northern Territory of Australia would be a subject-specific question. So next, we're still in the first order realm here, debatable but not a knowledge question. Is payback barbaric and out of date? So payback is the term for Indigenous justice and punishment. Now we're starting to move into second order questions. How can we determine what constitutes acceptable punishment? So this lets us explore different ways of knowing, and in a way to help us figure out, well, what is an acceptable punishment? We can look at reason, we could look at intuition, we could look at emotion, as ways of knowing to help us inform this decision on what is an acceptable punishment. And then our last one is a strong second order question. To what extent should one's culture impose its laws on another? And so now we're going higher. We can draw on ways of knowing as well as areas of knowledge to answer this question, and it opens up real life situations, a large extent of real life situations. All right, so that's it for our level 1 of crafting good knowledge questions. All right, thanks everyone.